Welcome to High Noon, where we discuss controversial subjects with interesting people. First off, I want to apologize for not having an episode up this last week. That was because I was quite ill and I was coughing and hacking the whole time. And I think that would be very uncomfortable to listen to as a listener. So, in that eventuality, we decided not to record last week, but we are back with a great guest this week. David Marcus is a reporter for the New York Post, where he reports and writes on subjects of contemporary political interest, all kinds of things. He's also the author of the book Charade, The COVID Lies That Crushed a Nation. In full disclosure, he was also a former colleague of mine at The Federalist. And one of the things that I really love about Dave's work is that he comes to it with a totally different perspective than I think most people do in the political world. So his background is actually in theater, and he's an actor. Which is very different than most people, I think, in politics, or the poli-sci background, or they're the kind of class president types. Dave has a totally different background. I think that really comes through in his work. And he also has this really great ability to talk to people from all walks of life and to really communicate their stories in a way that I think is a lot more human than sort of analytical. And that really comes through in this book. So welcome, Dave, to High Noon.
Thank you, Inez.
So in this book, you not only interview folks in the administration, the Trump administration. Your book kind of ends with the election of 2020. But you not only interview folks like in the administration, you interview Tucker Carlson, you interview a lot of people in politics, but you also interview, you talk a lot about some of your friends that you were hanging out with and their perspectives on the COVID pandemic. And then also even you talk to a sex worker in Las Vegas and what that did to her trade in terms of getting more or fewer customers. How did you decide who to put into this book? This is really more of a memoir of that time, even though you have a lot of great facts in it as well.
Yeah, that was a challenge right off the bat. When I started work on the book, one of the books I wanted to model it off of was Molly Hemingway and Carrie Severino's book, Justice on Trial, about the Kavanaugh thing. So I really liked that book. Molly was also a colleague at the Federalist, so I sort of talked to her about it. What became clear as I started writing was that whereas that was a story and most books are about something that literally affects some small group of people and the rest of us are sort of paying attention to it, this affected everyone. And so there really was nobody who wasn't a part of the story. And I think the first kind of outside the administration or really outside of the box interview that I did was there's one point relatively early on where I interview a guy who's in the advertising industry because I think viewers will remember in the early days of the lockdown, there were all these ads and they were like the same ad. It was like piano music and shots of empty streets. And then you had shots of first responders and, we're all in this together, all the slogans, and every ad was the same one. And I was very curious, right? Like, how did this happen? There wasn't some meeting of all the advertising executives to say like, we're all going to run the same ad. And this guy was really able to walk me through why that happened, which really had a lot to do with sort of like lawyers and copycatting, right? Because it was something where like they really didn't want to get it wrong. And so there was one sort of safe way to do it. And so they all did that. And once I did that interview, I realized that the two most important functionaries in the lockdown story were the government and the media. Obviously the government because they couldn't literally impose lockdowns, but the lockdowns weren't really imposed for the most part. For the most part, we consented to them. And that had a lot to do with the media. So then those were the two areas where I really chose to put most of my focus.
Yeah. And you, it was kind of a weird experience to read this book because it really took me back to the mentality in April, May of 2020, right? Where in DC and then when New York, where you were, there was this eerie silence on all of the streets. This is before people, before there was a lot of the research that said that, for example, walking around outside was not a danger in terms of transmission. So the streets were eerily empty, except for the sirens, right? The sirens of the emergency vehicles are taking people to and from the hospital. So you really bring us back there, and then you kind of seem to then question that we perhaps even at that point made some decisions on the basis of fear rather than science.
Yeah, I think that what we've never been able to do with this thing, and this goes right up to this present moment, is come up with some kind of rational balance between legitimate competing interests in terms of like what the risk to human life from COVID was versus what the risk to kids not being in school or people having to wear masks or shutting down businesses, you know, the whole parade of horribles that lockdowns brought. We were never really able to have a rational discussion or a rational consideration of, you know, people were going to die one way or the other, in fact, both ways. And we got into this sort of mentality of, you know, if it saves one life, and that's not how public policy or human life operates, right? I mean, like, if you let your daughter do gymnastics, if you let your son play football, there's a risk that they could get pretty seriously hurt. And so you weigh that and you know, you make the decision because there are also benefits to those activities. And I think we just so utterly failed as a country to do that for a myriad of reasons. But yeah, we did a really bad job with it.
Well, one of those reasons is that, you know, when you hire people who are experts in their field, they're often going to look at, and Thomas Sowell famously wrote about this, but they're often going to look at essentially a single factor analysis, right? We had a lot of public health bureaucrats who were, as you say, that their goal was to get to zero COVID cases, right? And you would think that in our system, the appropriate balance then would be, okay, yes, you experts, you medical professionals, you're here to give advice to the political branches, which are then going to weigh that goal of making sure that there are zero COVID cases against all of the other things as part of political judgment, right? Against economic factors, against what might happen in extended lockdowns to the psychology of children if they can't go to school, right? So these aren't decisions that are made, quote unquote, on the basis of science. They necessarily involve political judgment. I mean, it seems like kind of the story you're putting out in this book is that we abdicated political judgment wholly into the hands of experts, and like they don't need to be nefarious. They are looking at a single factor, whereas our political leadership kind of abdicated their role in balancing that factor versus all the other, public policy implications.
Oh yeah, I mean that's 1000% right. I mean, very early on, you would often hear people say, you know, there's no place for politics in all of this. And it's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, as you point out, like Anthony Fauci might be an expert in, you know, viruses and infectious disease. He's not an expert on unemployment or education or a whole range of public policy aspects that were affected by the choices that we made in terms of lockdown. So obviously, these needed to be political choices, and it got even worse because all across the country, state legislatures just said to governors, like, okay, you know, be the emperor, right? For a year, I mean, for longer. So a lot of these powers like still exist. This is unprecedented in American history. And one of the points that I make in the book about this move to empower governors to really just do whatever they want is that governors don't do constituent services, right? As citizens, when we need to go to our politicians and say, hey, I need to be able to open my restaurant, I need to be able to go to church, I need to be able to send my kid to school, you don't go to your governor, you go to your state assemblyman, you go to your state senator. And that was gone. That was just all gone. And thankfully, we're now starting to see states, even blue states like Pennsylvania, start to pull back. Not only pull back some of these powers right now, but Michigan just passed a law that changes it so that this can't happen again. So if there's a silver lining, like that might be it. We need to realize that you can't hand total dictatorial power to governors for a year. It's a disaster.
Right, and even though governors have that kind of broad power in emergencies, generally most emergencies are short term, right? That would be the justification of handing decision making power to one elected official rather than the normal legislative channels, right? It's that legislatures move slowly. They take into account, as you say, constituent services and everything, but a single actor can make those decisions quickly in an emergency. But that rationale gets weaker and weaker over time, right? When we're talking about already, well over a year, pushing towards a year and a half of dealing with this pandemic, that rationale certainly at least starts to get weaker, if not disappears altogether.
It does get weaker, but when you think about the precedent that we just created, if a sufficient number of Americans can be convinced that climate change is a public health crisis, or that racism is a public health crisis, which in fact several states and localities have already declared, right? Then we now have a precedent in place where, for those reasons, or really anything that we determine to be a public health crisis, we can just suspend the Constitution and allow governors to rule as kings. So I think more than anything else, that's what we need to look at in all of this and make sure never happens again. The problem was partisanship, not politics. We needed more politics, not less politics.
Yeah, and I guess I totally agree with that in a sense, even though you and I have quite different views about the virus itself and what was necessary to contain it. You tend to be more longer term or almost completely against the lockdowns. I think they were an appropriate tool at one time, that perhaps that rationale doesn't extend for month after month after month. But we have different views on that. But I think we can agree on this, that this is, at the end of the day, a political judgment. It has to be, as because of the reasons we were talking about, right? Like, this isn't a single factor. We're not only concerned with coronavirus in the world. There are many other things that can kill people, and even if, and that's just restricting the analysis to things that can kill people, right? There's
Right.
also a factor of quality of life and freedom and constitutional liberty that is not quantified in a single factor analysis. But let's talk about the difference between competency and messaging, right? Because I will fully admit that I, in April and May, was completely fooled by Governor Andrew Cuomo. He did not share my politics, right, at the time, but he was giving these really competent sounding briefings, right? Whereas oftentimes, I mean, some of the Trump briefings were really good. The Trump administration briefings were really good. But other times the president was distracted. He played his kind of usual role in goading the media, which I think felt very different to people in April 2020 than it did, for example, in the preceding part of his administration, because it's one thing to dunk on the media. We all know they deserve it. But when people are really scared and looking for a projection of confidence from their leaders, there were times where I thought that Trump's messaging did not project that, whereas Andrew Cuomo's did. And then we go back months later and look at their actual records, which you do really well in this book. And we see that actually the projection of competence is not at all the same thing as actual competence. Could you go into a little bit what some of the decisions that the Trump administration did early on that didn't get a lot of press versus some of the decisions that the Cuomo administration in New York made, that at the time one seemed competent and one didn't? And it seems like the truth was almost the reverse.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it was. I mean, listen, I can't imagine anything as poorly suited to Trump's rhetorical skill set as this particular crisis. His sort of hyperbolic nature and how should I put this? His sometimes wavering relationship with the literal truth work in some context. I think they work in foreign policy. I think they work in some domestic policy negotiations. I think they can be really effective messaging tools, not with this. And a great example, the very first thing I wrote about the coronavirus, I believe it was titled something like "Trump Needs to Shut Up About Coronavirus." And he had gone on Sean Hannity the night before. I don't have the exact date. I believe it was the first week of March. So this is all really just starting to kick in. He goes on Hannity, and at the time, the World Health Organization was saying that this had an infection fatality rate of 2, 3, maybe even 4%, which is crazy, right? Which is vastly more deaths than even we experienced, and we experienced a lot of deaths. He went on Hannity and he said, I have a hunch that it's a lot lower than that, probably even less than 1%, just, you know, from conversations I've had with people. And the media blew up. And I mean, I did too. It was like, that's like going into your doctor who says, like, you've got stage 4 cancer, but I have a hunch you'll be fine, right? Like, that's not how you say that. And he was pilloried and he lost some trust because that's not the way you talk about it. He was also exactly right. And in that interview, he explained why he was right. The reason he was right was that asymptomatic people weren't being tested. By early April, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford would do seroprevalence tests that would show that way, way, way more people had COVID than we knew had COVID. And therefore, the infection fatality rate was a lot lower. That messaging never really caught back up in the media, unfortunately. So that was a prime example of where Trump was saying something important and true in a really ineffective way and just lost the thread utterly. Meanwhile, an example on the other side, you would have Cuomo in those early days, you know, seeming really confident, but on a day-by-day basis going back and forth between New York won't shut down, New York will shut down, we need to do contact tracing. In fact, by the time we were seeing these cases in New York, contact tracing was probably pointless. You know, contact tracing can be effective when you have a really small number of cases. But again, we had so many more cases than we knew we did because we weren't testing asymptomatic people, that we were probably well past the point where, I mean, remember Bloomberg was going to have an army of contact tracers? Do you remember that? This was like a week and a half news cycle where Cuomo was going to put former Mayor Bloomberg in charge of the contact tracing, and this was going to be great. And like, look at this wonder. None of that happened. It just didn't happen. It sounded good.
That's right. I mean, he sounded good. That was the whole appeal of Governor Cuomo. And at one point, people were talking about whether or not he might replace Joe Biden on the ticket because he was so massively popular because of these. And we've really seen that flip, the politics of this flip, almost the opposite, right? Where we have folks like Gavin Newsom now, Governor Gavin Newsom in California, under threat of recall, largely because of keeping in place really strict restrictions in California far longer than other governors, and for his own personal hypocrisy in not following those restrictions. Those turned out to be issues that really resonated with a lot of people who were not getting interviewed for, New York Times articles or Washington Post articles. One of the myths that you go into here in this book is, which by the way, I can hold it up. Here it is. But one of the myths you go into is that, we had this rhetoric in the beginning of us all being in this together. And in some sense, as you said early on in the podcast, we were all in it together in the sense that everybody was subject to, potentially getting infected with the coronavirus. It was a scary time. We, were afraid to speak to our neighbors or to get too close to our neighbors or friends. And so in that sense, we were going through similar fears, but we were, what ended up happening is that, in fact, different groups of people ended up experiencing the lockdowns completely differently. Can you maybe talk a little bit about who turned out, and this is a weird word to say, but I think it's the right word, who benefited from the pandemic and the lockdowns, and who really took the brunt of them?
I mean, I did. I got a book deal, right? A lot of people in the media did. I was very, very cognizant of the fact that I already worked for home. I was New York correspondent for the Federalist at the time, so I basically worked out of my apartment anyway. My paychecks didn't stop. In fact, I got a stimulus check. So for a lot of people in the media class, it was a very different experience than being a waiter who, loses your job, or being a truck driver who loses their job. And, I live in a neighborhood in Brooklyn that's sort of very, residential. It's not a well-off neighborhood, but it's, solidly middle class, and I started seeing lines around the block of people waiting for food. I mean, I'd never seen anything like that in my lifetime. And it became quite clear to me that the story that the media was telling us about this, sort of adventure where we all play camp in our house while we get our paychecks was very different than the reality that a lot of people in the world were facing, in the rest of the country were facing. That was, for a lot of people, a fairly existential level of crisis.
There was also an effect on the different businesses that did better or worse, right? So, for example, Amazon raked in additional, I think it was an additional billions in profits over the course of the pandemic than they had the year before, while a lot of bodegas or restaurants or other kind of small businesses or even large businesses who had no way to really put their services online or remotely really, really suffered. So we had this bifurcation.
Yeah.
What do you think that the impact of that bifurcation is going to have going forward, even as hopefully we reach the end of this pandemic, as vaccination rates are rising again, and as we're kind of experiencing a third and hope or fourth, hopefully last wave of this that doesn't seem to be resulting in the same level of hospitalizations or death as the previous waves are. As we move out of, cross our fingers, out of the pandemic era, how are the impacts of that business bifurcation and the different ways that I'm going to use the word that's unpopular on the right, like essentially different classes of people, how they experience the pandemic. How's that going to change our politics going forward?
I think it's already having a huge impact on the way conservatives and some on the left, but more really conservatives think about big tech, because you're very right to point out that Amazon was one of the winners here, right? In general, big tech was a winner because when you make people stay at home, sort of atomized in their house, then all of the things that all these machines that go were do for us become more valuable, and everything that actually happens out in the world of hugs and handshakes it diminishes, right? What we realized, I think, by a few months in, was that the same big tech that was bringing us our Big Macs was also determining what news we were allowed to see about things like the lockdown itself. This created just an enormous conflict of interest, in that this same sector of the economy that was reaping incredible profits was in control of the information that kept those profits rolling in and that kept these lockdowns in place. And I think that I think you had already seen a few politicians, like maybe, Hawley and a few others, pardon me, who were wary of big tech, but still had to appreciate this sort of the orthodoxy of conservatives as small government, and these are private businesses, they can do whatever they want. Um, I think when we saw what big tech was able to do in terms of the lockdowns, that changed for a lot of people. It changed for me, and I think, in fact, I know from politicians who I speak to now, as a reporter, at least in private and in some cases in public, um, Republicans don't care if it's private business anymore. This threat is too big and it has to be dealt with. And I think that's a change in our politics that we're going to see over the next several years, and probably going forward even beyond that.
You talk about atomization and really, I mean, these were conversations that were happening both on the right and the left before the pandemic and before the lockdowns, about a sense of alienation, the fact that people did not have as thick ties to family, church, community, real world interaction as they used to, perhaps. We have folks like Tim Carney writing his book about alienation, Alienated America. And there was this kind of conversation going on that was coupled with Gen Z being a generation that was even more online than perhaps my generation, the millennials, and definitely more online than Gen X, which is your generation. How has this essentially enforced online period of a year and a half accelerated perhaps some of these trends, whereby your digital self becomes or seems in some way more real to a lot of people than the flesh and blood selves of ourselves walking around. You call it a hugs and handshakes world. Like, we can call it derisively the meat suit world, right? But it seems like our relationship with the body and physicality was already being attenuated by social media and by technology, and now we've had a year and a half where that digital self was essentially the only self, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how's that going to impact the psychology of especially Gen Z, but even the rest of us going forward?
I mean, I'd like to say, I'd like to be hopeful, but I don't feel hopeful about it. I think it's gonna, I do think it's gonna further this alienation, and it's not only alienation from each other. In a lot of cases, it's alienation from reality. I mean, it may seem strange to bring something like, the transgender debate into something like this, but I think it actually has a place, because it's not just transgenderism, it's trans everything. It's like, if you can really be that avatar in the video game that is most of your reality, then why would any of these rules apply, right? And yeah, I mean, there are very broad trends going on in terms of the way in which the human mind interacts with computers. Even people, with sort of like the idea that a human mind could ultimately be downloaded into a computer. I mean, enormous, huge questions that the only thing I've ever really been able to compare it to is Hermann Hesse wrote a great book called The Glass Bead Game. And it takes place in, I mean, he wrote it, I guess, in like the 50s, or it takes place in what would have been a futuristic Europe, right? And there's really only two forces left. There's the players of this esoteric glass bead game, which you could, in a weird way, compare to the internet, even though he couldn't have imagined the internet. But it's just sort of like every type of piece of information and knowledge interplaying together, and these really smart people are able to like sort of put them in boxes. The only other one is the Roman Catholic Church, right? And that's it. Like these are the two extremes that you end up with. And I think we are sort of moving in that direction to an extent. And it's interesting. Like, there have been several people I've known, is I sort of wear my Catholicism on my sleeve a little bit. There have been several people that I've known who somewhat unexpectedly told me that the Catholic Church is something that they've been looking to join or become a part of or get back to throughout all of this. Even just anecdotally going to mass, I just see a lot more people there, like maybe because they weren't allowed to or whatever it was. But to me, that's the only hope, is that, a push for sort of organized religion, and my preference is the Catholic Church, but that kind of push is what can push back against the atomization of online life. But man, it's an uphill battle.
Well, we're seeing the opposite trend, right? The famous rise of the nuns, NONES, among which I count myself, where there are more people who not only don't consider themselves, part of a faith tradition in the abstract metaphysical sense, but also don't have that concrete reason to get together with people, with other people they may not know, their neighbors that maybe then become friends, that to actually have that kind of thick community that is provided by in-person religious organizations. And it doesn't really seem like there's going to be a replacement, even from the non-theological perspective, just from the human sort of community perspective. It doesn't seem like modern life has really provided human beings with another way to have some kind of immediate and physical commonality, common purpose, and shared life with the people around them.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and it does go beyond church. It's, the Rotary Club, or it's 4-H, or it's called 4-H, right? I grew up in Philly. I was sort of pulling that out of a vague memory. But whatever these things are, like bowling leagues, like, there were things, you watch sitcoms from the 1950s and 60s, and like, everybody's got these activities that they do in the evening, whatever they were. And those are by and large, at least in sort of like modern urban American life, things that really don't exist so much anymore. And yeah, we haven't done a very good job of replacing them. I think even performance, like even the arts, have done a poor job. Theater is not as well attended as it once was. Dance, comedy does a little better, but there's a struggle even there. Even before the pandemic, these were trending in the wrong direction. So I don't know. As you mentioned at the top, I spent the first 15 years or so of my adulthood involved in theater, and so I was producing shows, and my whole deal was like, how many people can I get in a room, right? Because like that's how I made my money. And I still like that feeling of having a lot of people in a room, but I mean, there's just fewer and fewer opportunities to do that, and less points of interest that bring people together.
Why is it that the arts in the United States are so overwhelmingly left wing? Because I mean that hasn't been true in all places and all times, right? Why do you think that the theater community, or really out of the examples you mentioned, only comedy is somewhat of an exception, in the sense that there are some comedians who will target left-wing pieties for mockery? I mean, I don't even know that to the extent that makes them quote unquote conservative, but that will sort of target, at least as part of their act, they will go after things that are taken for granted on the left. But really, the other arts, Hollywood, theater, even fine art, painting, sculpture, this seems to be now an overwhelmingly left wing space. Was that the case when you got into it, or has it changed over the course of the more recent decades? And then why do you think that is?
It was. I mean, the left was not as far left in 1998 as it is today, so it was a different kind of left. But I mean, it was all left. There were no Republicans. I wasn't even a Republican yet. There was every once in a while there was like the weird like actual libertarian who kind of just liked to pick fights, right? But there were no Republicans. The reason for it, I believe, and I believe this very strongly, is the not-for-profit movement taking over art forms like theater and art forms like dance. And I do think that comedy is the exception that proves the rule here. Because when you think about not-for-profits in terms of theater and dance and that stuff, you're talking about universities and colleges, talking about non-profit performing groups or companies, which is pretty much everything outside of Broadway. You're talking about nonprofit granting organizations. All three of the legs of that stool are incredibly progressive, and they produce incredibly progressive art that doesn't pay for itself. It doesn't have to pay for itself because it's basically all funded by donors. And every once in a while, something breaks out and actually makes money. Stand-up comedy is different, right? You don't really get a master's degree in stand-up comedy the way that you do for directing or acting or screenwriting. The way you get that job is still pretty much to show up at the club, and either people laugh or they don't. And if they laugh, you get more gigs. If they don't, you don't. And that is absolutely why you see more ideological diversity in the world of stand-up comedy than you do in any of these other art forms. So I think if conservatives want to compete in that cultural space, two things need to happen. One, they need to pay some attention to it, which they haven't done, right? I mean, Andrew Breitbart was warning about this over a decade ago, and the call still hasn't been heard. But second of all, I think they do need to break up some of these nonprofit systems that really just bar entry unless you have a rich uncle who's going to give you $15,000 for your theater company.
So what are some of those nonprofit systems? You mentioned the NEA, right? So there are government grants, and then
Yep.
there are essentially donor grants connected to art schools. Is that how this works?
I mean, it all is, right? I mean, if you give $100 to a theater company or a dance company, some of that money is coming out of the general fund of the government, right? Like that's how a tax deductible organization works. So essentially, the theater company that I was the co-producer for, we were never a not-for-profit, so we always kind of had to find unique ways to cover our costs. The general model is that you set up a not-for-profit, you get yourself a board. Hopefully, again, you're well connected enough to have, board members who have some money to kick in as well. You hold a gala, you go fundraise, and generally speaking, the goal is to make about half of your money back through ticket sales. Maybe, I mean, that's great, right? If you're able to do that. And so it becomes this kind of like perverse economic model where you really don't have creative destruction, because if you're coming out of Columbia or Yale drama school and you're trying to start a theater company, your first question is not, how do I get an audience? Your first question is, how do I get a grant? And until that gets turned around, nothing changes.
So what would you say then to the objection? Because I feel like if I was coming to this conversation with a different perspective than the culture warrior that I am, I would worry about, that great art would not find it. I mean, so much of what we consider great art did not find a productive paying audience while the artist was alive, right? And I mean, so how do we balance the need to create a space where artists can, in fact, do create art or do their thing, right? But still have it, because I think you're right. Like we've gone from having a sort of a marketplace of different types of art that appeal to different kinds of people to almost an exclusively avant-garde way where most artists are only appealing, as you say, either to grants, donors, or they're appealing to a handful of critics who usually work for elite media outlets, right? They're not really trying to get an audience. They're not really aiming at, let's say, the average middle class American who might want to come see a play on Broadway, for example, even. Although that's probably more aimed at the average American than a lot of aspects of art. But I mean, how do we balance between, yes, you want a space for some avant-garde, sensibilities that are beyond what can attract a mass audience, but still have some connection to like to the broader mass of people who are actually, and giving them an entry into wanting to interact with the art world. Because I think the flip side of how we've set it up now is that the average American thinks that they don't have a lot to understand or gain from interacting with the art world because it seems so avant-garde, so like sort of, isolated or I'm searching for a word here, but so internal in its interest that it's very difficult for the average viewer to even feel competent enough to experience or break through or actually be a member of an audience for a lot of our art.
Yeah, I think the audience is right, and I think that's why they're not showing up. In fact, I the audience is almost always right, like almost by definition. Like this is your job, is to entertain people. Your job isn't ultimately to make everybody stop being racist, however you define that. Your job isn't ultimately to settle some class conflict. Your job is to, as we were just talking about, get people in a room to have a good time with each other. If you can do that other stuff too, okay, like that's fine. But I don't even know that I accept the basic concept that like the American people don't want, or that most people don't want complicated or high or fine art. Like Fred Siegel wrote a great book called Revolt Against the Masses, where he talks about what the average TV lineups for a Saturday afternoon were in the 1950s and the early 60s. And I mean, you had Leonard Bernstein with the Philharmonic have an incredibly popular show about classical music. You had Tennessee Williams plays. You had Shakespeare plays. You had an enormous appetite for this. People, you're probably too young for this, but people my age will remember their parents or grandparents having these leather-bound volumes of the great books of the world, right? Those sold like wildfire, and they cost a lot. I mean, they cost a lot of money, and people bought them. And at some point, the elite in our country kind of decided, like, you know what? That's not for a truck driver. That's not for a bus driver. That's not for the guy who makes pizzas. That's for somebody else. And I think the not-for-profit system reinforces that. And quite frankly, I don't worry about not having any art if we don't have the NEA. I mean, we've always had art. It's arguably the oldest thing in humanity, right? I mean, you look at somebody like Václav Havel. Not only was the communist government in Prague not giving him money to do his art, they were like trying to arrest him, and he still made it, right? So I mean, the art's not going to stop. So yeah, I'm not worried about that, and nobody's owed it, right? Like nobody gets to get out of like 2 years of a master's degree at some Ivy League school and be like, hey, I did my time. Like now you have to give me $100,000 a year to be an artist. That's not how it goes.
When did this flip happen from the 1950s, where, as you say, and I agree, there was just a way more. There was a lot more distributed of what we might call like great art throughout popular culture. Even, I mean, even thinking about 1950s versions of Mickey Mouse cartoons, right?
Sure.
Or
Looney
they
Tunes.
often were scored with classical music, great classical music. They made references to Shakespeare. So even at the child entertainment level, our pop culture was infused with something of higher value.
Mm-hmm.
And that was popular, as you say. It was popular, and people spent large proportions of their income on it. I'm wondering if that changed maybe with the camp movement, which seemed to be
Yes,
contemptuous of what we might call like middle brow taste,
that
right?
is that is
That
Siegel's
only the
theory.
esoteric was. You think it changed with the camp
That,
movement?
no, that's Siegel's theory. He
Oh,
he
okay.
he calls it kitsch, but yeah, basically Siegel's theory. My theory veers more in the direction of that is also the period of time when the nonprofits really came in, and late 50s, early 60s is when most of those laws passed. But yeah, that's the period. I mean, early to mid 60s is when the change happened. I think we could probably look at a bunch of reasons why. But yeah, that's when it changed. And by the 70s, it was completely different.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it parallels so many things that just seem uh, we take for granted, right? Like the idea that cities, for example, have high crime,
Mm-hmm.
that poverty correlates with high crime rates. Like these are things that have not always been true, but since the 1970s, we basically accept as ironclad rules. And one of those things is that the average American is interested in patronizing the arts, or patronizing. I don't know how you say that word, but patronizing the arts. Especially fine art. But you're right to say that that's completely not inevitable, and in fact was different at one time. So, how do you think? Let me wrap and tie these two subjects together: the subject of your book, and then the subject or the profession that you have dedicated most of your life to until you became a writer. Um, what is the future of those kinds of live audience events that you seem to be so attached to? I mean, you mentioned that you're not sure if people, even post coronavirus, if sort of people will be so digitized, atomized online that they're not going to be interested in attending these kinds of events, or do you think that there's going to be a resurgence as you said, more people are going to your attending mass at your church? Maybe there'll be a similar resurgence in people just who really want to get that feeling of being in the middle of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people that has been denied to us both by the pandemic and then the attendant lockdowns.
I mean, that's the tension, right? I don't think that we reached the orgiastic levels of the summer of 2021 that a lot of people were expecting or looking forward to. I also don't think that everybody, stayed, hidden in their apartments. I mean, Manhattan's popping more than it was. But it's a real tension. It's very strange to be watching television today and, watch a certain news network. And it's like, I'm seeing pictures of these hospitals that they say are almost to capacity, right? And I'm seeing these charts about COVID numbers, and I'm seeing the president saying, put a mask on. And then it cuts to commercial break, and it's an ad for a concert in Central Park in August, right? That's supposed to be, oh, we're bringing it all back, right? And it's like, wait a minute. Like, on the one hand, you're telling me the Delta variant is like way more transmissible, and I get it that the Central Park thing's outside, but like people have to get there or whatever. So these messages are just at utterly cross purposes, and I don't know where it ultimately leaves the American people. I would like to think one thing that gives me a weird hope, even though my son desperately wants one of those like headset VR things, and even though I probably will get him one at some point, those have not taken off quite the way that I think a lot of people expected. Like Google Glass was a failure. That people are buying the headsets, but it's not this overwhelming thing. And I do think there is a level at which when you put one of those things on and you are so cut off from the actual world around you, I think it still makes people uncomfortable. Now that might change, right? I mean, if you've seen the movie Ready Player One, that envisions a world in which that has changed. But I still think today, if you put one of those things on someone's head after about 6 or 7 minutes, they kind of want to know if someone's standing behind them or like if anybody's in the room or whatever. So there may be that the human mind and human emotions, that there is a limit, right? And that at a certain point it's not enough, or conversely it's too much, and we need that regular human interaction. But boy, I don't know. I mean, I guess we're going to find out.
That brings up a final point, a final question I have for you. And do you think that we've been denied catharsis in a way after this pandemic, because the issues during the pandemic became so politically contentious for various reasons, because they became part of our culture war battles, because we are at each other's throats about this. This definitely wasn't a coming together moment for America. Do you think that we've been denied? Because I kind of expected at the beginning of this that when it was over, that we would all come back together and have a huge party and cry and hug each other and say, it's over, right? We suffered through this historical pandemic, and now that's come to an end, and we can enjoy each other's company. And I thought there would be like this explosion of catharsis. And what we're seeing instead is that we're kind of separating even more. It seems like some people's pandemics ended, a year ago, and a lot of people's pandemics, it almost seems like they are never. There's very little that, other than going to absolutely zero COVID cases, that's ever going to make them go back to a pre-pandemic normal. I mean, have we been denied that catharsis? And then what does that mean for our future going forward in the next, year, 2, 3 years?
I mean, we probably have. I mean, maybe it's been a slow catharsis, because it's like, now you can go back inside a restaurant, then you couldn't, then you could. Now you can do this, now you can do this. So I mean, there's been this sort of slow opening up. But you make a really good point about the difference depending on where you are in the country, right? Like very early on in this, and again, I was still at the Federalist, right? And I was on like one of the lists, was we were like, talking about stories or whatever, and I said, is this the most significant crisis that the United States has faced since, and I can't remember if I pulled a Joe Biden and went Civil War, or like what I went with, but I went with something a long time ago, right? And the managing editor, our friend Joy Pullman, replied back relatively quickly with, what crisis, right? And Joy lives in not in rural Indiana, but in not in urban Indiana, right? And her life never, right? Indiana wasn't one of those states like Florida and New York or Texas or California that became the like, we're going to put all our attention here and like, said this one's good, this one's bad. But there were states like Indiana that really didn't lock down all that much. And it didn't get noticed, and people's lives were not affected the way yours was and mine was, or whatever it was. So maybe the catharsis question goes back again to that question of like, we were never all in this together, right? Since we didn't all have the same skin in the game, ultimately, when the buzzer sounded, or when it eventually sounds, if it ever sounds, there's not going to be the kind of, parade that you have after your team wins the Super Bowl.
Dave, thank you so much for coming on High Noon. This is David Marcus. His book is Charade, which you can purchase, I believe, anywhere books are sold. And thanks, Dave, for coming on. You can find his work at the New York Post going forward. Is that right, Dave?
That's correct. And I waited all the way until the end for a sports analogy. So
I appreciate that, since I am totally one of those people who knows nothing about sports. I'm the sports ball girl who has no idea. So thank you so much for coming on, Dave.
thanks, Inez.
And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, iwf.org, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts and YouTube shows. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.